In order to create a reality where our investments can remain invested for as long as possible, we have to separate ourselves and our dependence from them. If we are withdrawing from our investments before we truly need them, we are going to negatively impact the process of compounding, and could even dip into our principal. As Charlie Munger once said, the first rule of compounding: never interrupt it unnecessarily. Any dependence on our investments will slow our growth or even erode our investments completely. We want to be in a position of choosing when to withdraw from our investments, instead of being forced to, especially at inopportune times. In an earlier lesson, we looked at this chart and learned that equity or stock markets experience accelerated growth after recessions. Being forced to withdraw from our investments when the market is down puts our funds on the sidelines just when we should expect them to perform their best. It locks in losses and minimizes what we have for the recovery, the exact opposite of what we'd ideally want. Surveys suggest that around 50% of Canadians live paycheck to paycheck, meaning that even missing one paycheck could start the unraveling of their finances. If we are only one missed paycheck away from having to withdraw from our investments early, it puts us in a very vulnerable position. We have a tendency to believe that bad things won't happen to us, even if we acknowledge that they are likely to happen to others. For example, we might acknowledge that someone getting into a car accident is possible, but dismiss it as a reality for ourselves, claiming that we are good drivers, or simply saying that it won't happen. But that doesn't mean we should approach our finances like nothing will ever go wrong, because that's setting our future selves up for failure. Similarly to how things outside of our control have influenced who we are today, many things outside of our control will influence who we become in the future. Even if we don't want something bad to happen, or don't think something bad will happen, we likely have little to no control over if it actually does. There's essentially 4 ways that we can approach managing risk with. Avoidance, trying to reduce risk by avoiding it altogether. Mitigation, doing what we can to decrease their likelihood or impact. Acceptance, understanding the risk and willing to manage it ourselves. Transference, transferring the liability of the risk to someone else. If we're thinking about driving, avoidance might mean avoiding driving altogether, or at least avoiding driving during higher risk situations, like at night or during bad weather. Mitigation might look like choosing to obey speed limits, driving laws, and best practices to make driving safer. Acceptance could be understanding that driving does contain risk, but deciding that it's worth doing in spite of its risk, that the pros outweigh the cons. And transference could look like having insurance in place to financially cover damages or loss in the case of an accident. When it comes to our finances, avoidance would likely be best reflected in our behavior and our ability to avoid mistakes. So we'll save that for the next lesson. But if we're looking at how we can mitigate and reduce the likelihood of a risk and its overall impact on us, that's where safeguards come in. One of the requirements from us to invest properly is having positive cash flow, or having more money each month than we are spending. This might sound obvious, but a lot of people rely on credit cards and other sources of credit just to get by. The worst financial situations I've seen all stem from abusing credit. It's an easy thing to get out of control, and then it can feel impossible to get back on track. Our first safeguard, which is probably the simplest, the most obvious, and the most abused, is spending less than you make. This helps us minimize risk by having less of our money pre-committed to multiple things. In the event that we miss a paycheck, have an unexpected expense, or whatever the risk might be, we should have more of our money to help deal with that risk. Outside of managing risk, this is also the catalyst for our investments and goals. If we're constantly getting into and dealing with our debt, it doesn't give us the resources needed to build wealth. Instead of getting ahead, we're basically treading water. Having positive cash flow makes the next safeguard possible. Having an appropriate emergency fund and savings set aside. As much as we want to try to keep everything under control, life happens, and we know we'll need funds to cover the unexpected. Emergency funds can typically range from 3 months of necessary expenses to 12 months of necessary expenses. It all depends on your job and how secure and stable it is. A more stable job could allow for a smaller emergency fund, while a less stable job could require a larger emergency fund. It also depends on our personal preference. Like we explored in the behavior and investing chapter, we all have different experiences and depending on those experiences, we may have different preferences. If you've lost a job or gone through financial difficulty in the past, you may naturally be inclined to have a more robust emergency fund. There's no concrete right or wrong answer here, other than having no emergency fund or savings at all. As I've heard before, not having an emergency fund is an emergency. As you build up your emergency fund, you could use a line of credit or low interest credit card in a pinch. The important thing is to understand the cost of borrowing and have a plan to not rely on high interest sources of credit. Having positive cash flow and an emergency fund can help mitigate the impact of risk, because although we might not see the risk coming, we'll be prepared for it, either partially or entirely. We always want to put ourselves in the best position possible. There's no way that living within our means and having savings available to us does anything but that. The final two safeguards are insurance through your employer and personally owned insurance. Insurance typically covers lower probability, higher consequence events. If you have a car, you should have car insurance, which can cover damage repair, loss of vehicle, theft, and recovery. Some people can go through life having multiple accidents or none at all. The probability for most is somewhere in between. Insurance works by collecting premiums from the many to cover the needs of the few. Premiums will be based on how likely the insurance company thinks a claim would be submitted and how much it would cost. Even though replacing a car is much less expensive than replacing a house, a car accident is much more likely, which is why we tend to pay more for car insurance than we do for house insurance. Since no one can predict a negative event, we all pay far less than the cost to replace our vehicle, with the understanding that in the event that we need a claim, our insurance provider will cover the cost. It's the same with house insurance. Hopefully you never need to completely replace your house, but if you do, the premiums the insurance company collects and invests covers the cost. Insurance is important for the simple reason very few people, especially early in life, have all the money they'll ever need and that their family will ever need if something bad happens. If we imagine what our assets and liabilities look like over our lives, maybe it looks something like this. By this point in the course, the assets projections should look familiar, with us accumulating investments over time and then depleting them during retirement. When it comes to liabilities, it's sort of the opposite. When you're younger, we may have lots of debt or financial obligations. Some of them are obvious, like student loans, a mortgage, car loans, or anything else. But some of them aren't so obvious, like having people who are dependent on you. A spouse and children could all be considered a financial obligation, and therefore a liability. Over time, though, your children grow up, your mortgage is paid off, and your liabilities reduce significantly. I like to look at our lives in two broad stages when it comes to liabilities. A time where our liabilities outweigh our assets, creating an insurable need, and a time where our assets cover our liabilities and then some, creating a time where we're essentially self-insured. A point where if anything happens to us, we have more than enough assets to cover our liabilities and our financial wishes. When we're younger, we simply don't have the time to accumulate a massive amount of assets. So having insurance to bridge that gap between what we have and need makes perfect sense. But with enough time, we reach a point where insurance can act more like a bonus than a necessity. There's two types of insurance that we rely on to safeguard us from our investments during our lives: disability insurance and critical illness insurance. In the event that we're unable to work due to injury or illness, disability insurance can provide a regular benefit that is designed to replace our income. Critical illness insurance is designed to pay out a tax-free benefit in the event of a life-threatening diagnosis, like cancer. Insurance through an employer is typically based on guaranteed pay, excluding overtime, bonuses, or shift premiums. This, along with the fact that no two people share the same financial situation, makes it important to not just assume you have enough coverage. Let's look at a simplified example. Let's assume that our friends Bob and Barb are both chefs at the same restaurant and earn the same income. Through their employer, they have the same insurance coverage based on their incomes. But outside of their job and income, it turns out that they live completely different lives. Bob is single, has no dependents other than his dog, and rents an apartment. Barb, on the other hand, is married with 2 young children, and has a large mortgage balance in her name. The coverage could be more than appropriate for Bob, but it's likely going to be nowhere near an appropriate amount for Barb. It's easy to assume insurance through your work is appropriate, but it's really only dictated by one thing: the amount of money they pay you. It doesn't take your entire financial situation into consideration, and it's easy to imagine a lot of people being underinsured, especially if they make above and beyond their base pay. Safeguards are things that we can depend on instead of our investments, at least until we intend to need them. Withdrawing from our investments years or decades early could easily remove 6 figures from our expected total at retirement, but the solution doesn't need to be complicated. Being in the habit of spending less than we make, establishing an appropriate emergency fund, and having proper insurance in place to cover the things we can't easily replace can all ensure that we leave our investments alone, allowing them to work for us. We tend not to think about what can go wrong, especially when it comes to ourselves. But the irony is that the people we're most doing a disservice to are ourselves and those closest to us. Thinking about what can go wrong doesn't make it more likely to happen, but it does give us more time and power to prepare for what life could throw our way. An emergency fund, savings, and insurance are all things we hope we never have to use. But in the case that we do, the joy of having it when we need it will outweigh the discomfort of planning for it by 1,000 times.